Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this webinar today. This is the third in our series of webinars focused on the Health and Care Professions Council's updated Standards of Proficiency. So our focus today is on changes to the standards around the key issues of equality, diversity and inclusion. And this event will be 45 minutes long today. Again, I'm really pleased to say that we're expecting a large number of attendees from all 15 professional groups regulated by us here at the HCPC, and as well as registrants and their employers, we're also expecting representatives from professional bodies and indeed very many members of the public. So your time is extremely valuable, and a very warm welcome, as I say, is extended to each and every one of you. So we recognise that some of you have attended our previous webinars in this series, and some of you, of course, will be attending for the first time. So I'll try to keep some of the introductory information as brief, but hopefully as helpful as I can for you. So as this is quite a large scale event today, we're expecting a lot of attendees. It's really important that we aim for it to be a smooth experience for you. So this means, unfortunately, that we are required to mute all microphones and cameras from our participants. This event is being recorded today, so if you are watching this at a later date and you're not able to participate in the live interactions that are planned for today, so you won't receive the post-event follow-up documents, of course, but you are invited to reach out to us if you've got any questions after the session. So let's do some proper introductions now and have a look at how today's session will progress. I'm conscious that I haven't introduced myself. So my name is Fiona Campbell and I work here at the HCPC as a professional liaison consultant, and my role covers Scotland. And alongside 4 other colleagues, we deliver the HCPC's outreach service across the 4 countries of the UK, known as the Professional Liaison Service. And our main job really is to seek to influence and support HCPC registrants to embed and achieve high professional standards. I'm an HCPC registered speech and language therapist myself, and before joining the HCPC last year, my career history was in the National Health Service and also the higher education sector in Scotland. So I'm talking to you from a relatively sunny Edinburgh today. Like many of you today, I've got a really strong clinical and professional interest in equality, diversity and inclusion, and how we support the people who need to use our services to be able to access our services, but also to be fully involved, prioritised and well understood in their care. So I'm really delighted to be supported in this webinar by 2 people, both of whom also have a very significant interest in equality, diversity and inclusion. So let me introduce you to them. So our first speaker today is Dr. Pam Ricketts, and Pam has got over 30 years of experience as an allied health professional, currently working in a very large community NHS Foundation Trust as a divisional lead for allied health professionals. And Pam in 2021 became the first council apprentice here at the Health and Care Professions Council. So Pam's commitment to ED&I is absolutely unwavering, and she's received, of course, several awards in recognition of her contribution to race equality and her commitment to inclusivity. So welcome to Pam. Pam, I wonder if you want to come on and say a few words.
Hello everyone. Nice to be here today, really excited to be here, hoping that the information that's going to be shared as we go along today will be really helpful to everyone. And so, as well as being a presenter, I'm also looking forward to hearing what's going to be said as well. So again, nice to be here.
Thank you very much indeed, Pam. And to introduce you to our second speaker, I'd like to welcome Adrian Barrowdale, who is a strategic lead for equality, diversity and inclusion at the HCPC. So Adrian has nearly 20 years of experience working across equality, diversity and inclusion, including across a number of public sector organisations, including police and NHS bodies as well as regulatory bodies. So Adrian's responsible for overseeing the HCPC's ED&I strategy and works across all of HCPC's regulatory functions. So we're delighted to have Adrian join us, and Adrian will be speaking at the end of today's event. I wonder if you'd come on, Adrian, and say a quick hello to all of us.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks, Fiona. I'm really pleased to be here, and obviously the subject matter of today's webinar is absolutely core to both my personal and professional interests, and like Pam, I'm really keen to kind of hear what we've got to say, hear what participants and attendees questions they might have, and yeah, and I'm looking forward at the end to kind of wrapping up just a little bit about what HCPC's work is in this area and what our future direction is.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Okay, so let's get started today. I think to start off, it's really important for me to say to everyone joining us that the HCPC recognises the massive amount of expertise that so many of our registrants attending here already have in delivering services and individual practices that are committed to equality, diversity and inclusion, and of course the very many ways in which you're currently achieving this at a really, really high standard. But we also understand and respect that some registrants, of course, are less sure of whether their individual practice is currently sensitive to some of the really important issues relating to equality, diversity and inclusion, and that's absolutely okay too. So our focus today has to be on open learning, discussing, of course, how the standards have changed in relation to equality, diversity and inclusion, and definitely exploring them in some detail, and hoping really to add some learning for everyone, regardless of your starting point. If you feel that you're quite expert in ED&I, that's super. Please contribute and let us learn from you. But also I wonder if there might be some other areas of improvement we could consider based on the learning of other people. We'll signpost you hopefully also to some resources and suggest some action planning for ongoing improvements that you can make in this area. It's really important also that we'll get an opportunity to discuss some of our own experiences of equality, diversity and inclusion, and Pam will be leading that part of the session. It's vital really for me to say that this session today is no replacement for formal training in equality, diversity and inclusion. It's our opportunity here to introduce you to the updated standards of proficiency and to enable us to do some action planning forward as to how we might improve in order to meet and exceed the standards that are currently in place and about to become in place rather from the 1st of September 2023. So let's remind ourselves, obviously, of the purpose of what we're doing today. The purpose of today is to look at equality, diversity and inclusion and the updates that are in place and the updated standards of proficiency which launch from the 1st of September 2023. So our standards of proficiency are, of course, our professional standards that all registrants must meet in order to join the HCPC register. And these set out the threshold standards that are considered necessary to protect the public. They set out very clear expectations of registrants in terms of their knowledge and abilities when they start practicing. And of course, registrants have to continue to meet the standards of proficiency that apply to their scope of practice. And this also includes the standards of proficiency, of course, around equality, diversity and inclusion. The standards of proficiency have, of course, been updated, and you'll know perhaps that the standards of proficiency contain a range of generic standards that apply to all 15 professional groups that we regulate and a range of profession-specific standards. It's important for you to check in with the standards that relate to your practice. The standards that we're discussing in our webinar, the ones that have been updated for all professions, are the generic standards and apply to all professions. But of course, they will apply in different ways to different professions, depending on the level of involvement, say, that you have with service users and who the service users are that access your services. So across the board, the standards have changed in these main ways, and we've covered 2 webinars already around centralising the service user and registrants' mental health and wellbeing. And today we're going to be looking at the significant expansion of the role of equality, diversity and inclusion in these standards. As an organisation at the HCPC, we seek to protect the public, and we're really committed to ensuring that our registrants can, of course, provide healthcare that's in the interest, if you like, to all service users, that healthcare is high quality and inclusive. And we understand, of course, as we've said, that many registrants are achieving really high standards relating to ED&I in practice. But we also understand at the regulator the central importance of ED&I in the safety and people's experiences and perceptions of health and care. So it's important to say that we already have equality, diversity and inclusion requirements in the current standard of proficiency and also in the standard of conduct, performance and ethics. But with the changes that we're suggesting going forward, it supports us as a regulator to reflect contemporary practices, but also demonstrate our commitment, of course, to strengthening our overall commitment to equality, diversity and inclusion. For those of you that are interested in the standards of conduct, performance and ethics, please note that these are also under review at this moment in time. The consultation is open for these, and if you're interested in the ED&I, of course, please do contribute to that, because there are quite significant changes being suggested to the standards of conduct, performance and ethics in this particular area. So we've got some details at the end of the session about how you can participate in that. The current standards, as they stand at the moment, feature 2 separate standards about equality, diversity and inclusion, and there are 3 separate statements made. So Standard 5 is that we'll be aware of the impact of culture, equality and diversity on practice, with the subdivision of Standard 5.1 that we understand the requirement to adapt practice to meet the needs of different groups and individuals. We also have Standard 6, which requires people to be able to practice in a non-discriminatory manner. What's quite important about the updated standards is that we have merged Standards 5 and 6 into one overarching standard, Standard 5, which now reads as follows: that registrants must recognise the impact of culture, equality and diversity on practice, and practice in a non-discriminatory and inclusive manner. If we go back, of course, we've got Standard 5.1 here, which requires registrants to really be understanding the requirement to adapt practice to meet the needs of different groups and different individuals. And that features and has been upgraded in some way in the new Standard 5.1, but it's been strengthened, of course, to mention that we need to respond appropriately to these groups and to recognise that these needs can be affected, of course, by any kind of difference. So Standard 5.1 now reads that registrants must be able to respond appropriately to the needs of all different groups and individuals in practice, recognising that this can be affected by difference of any kind, including, but of course not limited to, things like protected characteristics, intersectional experiences and cultural differences. At this stage, it's important for me to draw attention to some of the really subtle but key changes in the terminology that are used in the standards, so that the action is emphasised rather than simply having passive knowledge being required. So our language moves away from simply being aware of the impact of culture, equality and diversity, and perhaps being able to practice, to much more action-focused language. For example, recognising the impact of culture, equality and diversity, and actually practising in a non-discriminatory and inclusive manner. As we move forward, we've got newer aspects to these standards. So Standard 5.2 requires registrants to understand equality legislation and apply it to their practice. And Standard 5.3 mentions the importance of recognising the impact of our own values and personal biases, which of course may be unconscious, and as registrants being able to take personal action to ensure all service users and carers are treated appropriately with respect and dignity. Now, that important mention of unconscious bias and its impact on practice is new for us at the HCPC and reflects our position of really wishing registrants to take that positive action to understand, challenge and reflect on their own implicit assumptions and consider how this might impact on the way that they deliver care. As we move forward, Standard 5.5 is a new aspect to the standard. It's about understanding the duty to make reasonable adjustments and, of course, being able to make and support reasonable adjustments in your practice and support others to do that in their practice. And Standard 5.5 recognises the characteristics and consequences of the barriers to inclusion, including for socially isolated groups. And again, both of these areas are new in the standards to really make explicit reference to reasonable adjustments and to actively ask registrants to consider the causes, the indicators and the consequences of barriers to inclusion. Moving forward, Standard 5.6 requires registrants to actively challenge barriers that they've identified and support the implementation of change wherever possible. And Standard 5.7 asks registrants to recognise that regard, of course, to equality, diversity and inclusion needs to be embedded in the application of all HCPC standards across all areas of practice. And with this in mind, I think it's really important, that registrants read the standards of proficiency in their totality. That's our recommendation, because you can then begin to see the ways in which the different standards interact with one another. So, for example, you'll also see some really clear examples of how equality, diversity and inclusion is also mentioned in our updated leadership standards in the standards of proficiency. And you'll also see very clear threads of equality, diversity and inclusion running through other themes in the standards. So especially relating to those that are involving centralising service users in their care and taking the time that we need to understand service users' needs in full. At this point, it's probably useful to challenge a little bit around what about the groups of registrants that we have who perhaps don't interact regularly with members of the public, because we could interpret these standards as being quite specifically focused on those that deal with members of the public day in and day out. And of course, we know that some registrants don't, and some registrants, the particular scope of practice they have, may see them not necessarily interacting with the public as much as others. And we urge a reminder really that whilst the ED&I standards are relevant to your scope of practice, that reminder is there that ED&I learning and development relates to all interactions that we have, including those with colleagues. So it's really vital to be evaluating in your skills and upskilling where appropriate in all of these areas for all registrants. But at this point, it gives me great pleasure in the webinar to hand over to Dr. Pam Ricketts, who's going to share some key learning around equality, diversity and inclusion, and some of her experiences in practice and recommendations for registrants of the HCPC. So over to you at this moment in time, Pam.
Thanks, Fiona, and once again, hello to everyone. I want to start with a bit of a disclaimer. So if I could have the next slide, please. And it's just to say, I'm not an expert, and what I'm going to be sharing is really based on my own experiences, whether that as a professional and my experiences within work, or just experiences as a manager. So it's what I see, what I hear, and really how that resonates with me, and really what really drives my passion for equality, diversity and inclusion. So I just thought I'd start with just some definitions around equality, diversity and inclusion. In terms of equality, we're really talking about treating individuals fairly, ensuring they have equal opportunity to achieve their desired outcomes, and eliminate diversity of individuals and the different perspectives that they have to offer. And inclusion is really focused on ensuring that everyone has a voice and a means to participate, and that might involve making reasonable adjustments to what would be our usual processes. Next slide, please. I think we need to think more deeply than that, I would suggest, and really think about moving from a position of equality to a position of equity, diversity and belonging. And I think the visual that you can see now really just highlights what that really means. So if you give people the same resources and equal resources, that actually doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have the same chances, because if you're thinking about different individuals, different circumstances, different life chances, then actually if you just give people exactly the same resources, then that doesn't mean that they're going to have the same options in terms of progressing in their career, for example. So we really need to be moving to a position of equity, and that is really focused on recognising those differences and looking at what resources and what support and what opportunities are needed to then support someone to have the same chances, as I said, using the example of having the same opportunities to progress, giving those additional resources to enable someone to get there. So that might be extra courses, it might be giving extra support, mentorship, it could be anything. It's really homing in on what the individual needs are. One of the key acts as really brought as characteristics that are of real importance and areas of real focus: race and ethnicity, disability, religion or belief, age, sexual orientation, gender reassignment, pregnancy, marriage, partnership. There's lots of information out there on the Equality Act, and I would really encourage you to take some time to read that in more detail.
I think we're having a few problems, perhaps with an internet connection. I wonder if it might be helpful, Pam, if you're able to switch off your camera. Sometimes that can help with internet speed.
Okay, will do. So why is this important? Why do we really need to focus on equality, diversity and inclusion, or equity, diversity and belonging? I think it's very clear that we have health inequalities and workforce inequalities, and that is very prevalent now. There have been issues for a very long time, but it's becoming more and more prevalent, and in your day-to-day work you will see that people's health and life chances are significantly impacted by health inequalities. And within the workforce as well, you will come across individuals whose opportunities are significantly impacted as well. So just looking at health inequalities, I thought this was a really useful infographic to look at. It just highlights some of the challenges in terms of health inequalities for people of ethnic background. And the statistics on the slide come from the Race and Health Observatory. And I'm just going to pick out a couple of examples. So there's a 24% chance that people from an ethnic background will have increased risk of heart disease. There are also regional differences that will impact on health that will result in higher death rates. There are higher rates of diabetes in Black and Asian communities, higher risks of stroke. So just to give a few examples, but I think the infographic really does highlight some of those chances which impacts on life expectancy as well. And I think in terms of us as HCPC registrants and clinicians working out there with very diverse communities, we really need to ensure that when we are interacting with people, we are making every contact count. So making sure that we are addressing a wealth of needs, because what often happens is that people may not be aware of the services that are available. So we really do have a responsibility to make sure that we are signposting appropriately and ensuring people are aware of the services that are available to them and supporting them to access those services. So in terms of the workforce, as I said, there are challenges for some staff in terms of career progression, opportunities to progress their careers. And again, there are a set of standards that will support people and really kind of assess and measure what is going on within the workplace, and really set a standard of what we really need to be adhering to. So there are two key standards that really focus on that. So one is the Workforce Race Equality Standard, which is otherwise known as RES. And this is a set of measures that really ensure that employees from a Black and minority ethnic background have equal access to career opportunities and receive fair treatment in the workplace. The other standard is the Workforce Disability Quality Standard, which is WEDES. And again, it's another set of metrics that enables NHS organisations to really focus on actually what's happening within the workforce in terms of the experience of people with disabilities, and actually then what do we need to do to address some of those challenges. And I think at this point, I'll just share a little bit of my own experience. So for myself, I've haven't always felt that my chances in terms of progression have been wholly fair, and I often describe it as the good, the bad and the ugly. Sometimes when I'm speaking to people, they'll say, well, maybe you should say indifferent, but actually sometimes it has been really quite ugly. And I think if we're going to really tackle inequalities, and I know some of what I'm talking about is more on the lines of racial inequality, but if we are going to tackle inequalities, we really have to be honest about what is happening on a day-to-day basis. We really need to focus on some of the experiences that some will have, and I'm not saying it's all, but we need to focus on that, because if we're going to progress and we're going to improve, then we need to really focus on actually what has gone wrong, what can we do about it, what can we learn from that to take things forward to really make people's working lives more satisfying, more fulfilling. I have experienced discrimination, I have experienced harassment, I've experienced bullying, I have experienced racism, and going through that hasn't been pleasant. Sometimes it's very difficult to you deal with that. You speak to, what can you do? How do you escalate it? Sometimes it's felt easier to be silent, but over the years I've learned that actually if I'm silent, I'm complicit. I think it's really important that as professionals, as HCPC registrants, that we recognise and act. So if we see that something isn't right, don't be silent. It is something that we do need to address. If we want to improve the health of our nation and we want to give people the best health chances, then we need to make sure that on a professional level we do what we need to do. We have the HCPC standards to abide by, so we need to make sure we follow those. If we see that actually there are issues there, then we do need to flag that and address that. Because if in the workforce, if we can't get it right, we have to remember that we're going out to see patients and we don't want patients to experience any negativity. So for me, I suppose my key messages would be that diversity isn't something to be feared. Embrace it. Ensure that our service users and carers are treated with respect and dignity. Likewise, treat colleagues with dignity and respect. If there's something that you don't know, then respectfully ask a question, be curious, listen with fascination. People won't be offended. Don't make assumptions. And actually in doing that, you're educating, you're supporting and you're informing, and that can only be for good. As I said, challenge inappropriate behaviours and really take that zero tolerance to racism, discrimination, bullying and harassment of any form. So I've kind of talked about my perspective in terms of race, but any form of discrimination, we really need to take a zero tolerance approach to that. So finally, I think I'd just like to say that, the HCPC is here to protect the public. We have a professional responsibility to uphold HCPC standards, and that actually equality, diversity and inclusion should be a golden thread that runs across all areas of our professional practice. If there are any questions, if they could be put in the box, then that they will be fielded appropriately.
A really powerful and informative session. I do apologise to our listeners today that we had some technical issues that came up, but these things can't always necessarily be predicted. Pam, I think for me your ability to articulate the very central importance of ED&I in healthcare was so precise and remarkable for me, and I think clarification of some of those important conceptual frameworks too is quite helpful because they underpin, if you like, that vital need for ED&I. But I just want to acknowledge your kindness specifically and your time and your energy to interweave your own personal experience and to give voice to other health professionals who have faced adversity. As health professionals and members of the public, we have a duty to play, if you like, in preventing this from happening to our colleagues and of course the people who use our services. One thing that Pam said is a helpful kind of it's helpful for me in reflecting and encouraging registrants to think about health vulnerability. And Pam mentioned some of those important protected characteristics. And whilst we know that some groups, of course, may be more prone, if you like, to particular health conditions, we know that the protected characteristics don't necessarily point to the the specific health concerns, that in fact there are a whole number of different factors that might, you know, impact and interact to create additional barriers to accessing healthcare. So I think it's really important for us as HCPC registrants to be recognising that some individuals, certainly with the protected characteristics, may experience really significant additional barriers in accessing healthcare, or experience disparities due to the systemic inequalities that must be eradicated. But of course, I think that health vulnerability needs to be assessed on an individual basis, that broad generalisations can sometimes be unhelpful, and that we should be seeking, if you like, to understand specific health needs, risk factors and everybody's individual circumstances, rather than automatically assuming a vulnerability based only on protected characteristics. So I think it's really essential for us to promote inclusivity, equitable healthcare access and targeted interventions to address health disparities. And my kind of reflection question for you really as registrants as to how do we find space for those really challenging conversations? How do we feel about exploring an individual's specific health and care needs, especially around vulnerability? How do we feel, how well equipped do we feel to explore the range of factors that may be impacting on an individual's access to and experience of healthcare? And I'm thinking of some of the specific vulnerabilities that are so prevalent at this moment in time around poverty and rapid inflation and the difficulties, the social difficulties that people are experiencing in this country as a result of that. And again, importantly, something I think we can go on to do is to really be thinking about our unconscious biases and how they impact on our practices. So I think there's something about understanding what an unconscious bias is and beginning to challenge those and think about those implicit associations. So unconscious biases, of course, are implicit associations or stereotypes that affect our perceptions, our attitudes and our behaviours towards other people. And I think there's something about educating ourselves about different cultures, backgrounds and perspectives, reflecting and looking out for tools that we'll send you some examples of tools to really engage in some introspection and self-reflection to identify our own biases, to be seeking those diverse experiences, really to actively expose ourselves to diverse people, environments and different viewpoints. We all practice empathy when we work with service users on a daily basis, but putting yourself into someone else's shoes and trying to gain a deeper understanding of their viewpoint seems to be really important. The challenging of stereotypes and assumptions and engaging important open dialogue and implementing important checks and balances. We have to remember that as we work towards understanding and uncovering unconscious bias, that it's not an easy process and it can be confronting for us as registrants and requires really good self-reflection. But by taking some steps to think about this, then we can really foster more inclusive and equitable societies. My prompt questions to you as we come towards the end of today's session is my training in equality, diversity and inclusion up to date? And do I make strong efforts to understand individuals and what's unique about them, whether that be related to race, culture, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, those sorts of very important things. And my question also is, do I have the courage really to allow conversations to understand what other factors may be influencing people's experiences of healthcare? I've popped some other reflection questions on the slides, which I'll send out to you as we progress today's session. I'm going to come to my colleague Kim at this point because I think we may have some questions in the chat that we might be able to address at this point, and we certainly had a question that's come in prior to the event which I'd like to put to Adrian. Kim, would you have any objection if I go straight to Adrian's question?
No, of course not, Fiona. So Adrian, I know that you work for the, somebody knows that you work for the HCPC and saw that you were going to speak today. And it's clear that there's a commitment to ED&I by elevating the standards for registrants, that Fiona's already talked about, to reflect contemporary changes. So somebody's asking, as an organisation, what is the HCPC doing in relation to ED&I priorities to ensure that we are a fair and equitable regulator of healthcare professions?
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, and I think that's actually really the important question for us as a regulator. So we've been working on we've had our EDI strategy in place now for about 18 months or so. And in order to support that, we have an EDI action plan, which is really kind of sets out how we want to get on top of, obviously, what to me in my professional role is a really fundamental part of our work. And the last 12 months in particular, I think, have been really kind of foundational for us. So we're trying to kind of approach our work in a really structured way. So we want to get some of those building blocks in place, and some of that is about getting our standards right. So you've already heard, you know, an awful lot here to talk about today with our standards of proficiency. I mean, we really want to make sure that what we're saying about people's expectations of healthcare and registrants' ability to kind of meet changing health needs is right, and that it's active enough, and it's really driving forward that kind of inclusive practice that both Pam and Fiona have talked about in detail today. The review that's currently going on around our standards of conduct, performance and ethics, so, you know, really making sure that our expectations of registrants kind of match up to that, and allow us as well to kind of, you know, be more active and take action when there's inappropriate practice, and be a lot more outspoken in our kind of understanding of relationships between, you know, what it means for discrimination and its relationship to unsafe practice, to those incompatibility with safe practice, and our future forthcoming reviews around educations for our standards for education and training. So again, you know, making it really clear about what it is that we think those education and training providers are doing to meet the needs of learners, make sure that's well understood, to meet the needs of all learners. But a part of our EDI strategy, we've also got the inward looking pieces, making sure that essentially that we're competent and capable to be talking about this kind of stuff. And we're talking a lot about, you know, the outward facing stuff. What do we want of registrants? What do we want from our healthcare? But making sure that our competence as an organisation and also matches up to there. So, you know, we're doing a lot of work internally to try and make sure that as an inclusive employer that supports that, as Pam said, that concept of belonging, that we've got real strategies and work in place to address that. So, you know, we've got our internal mentoring scheme, which is specifically focused on increasing the representation of underrepresented staff in more senior roles, and also using our data. I think that probably more so than anything else, and any registrants on this session will undoubtedly be aware of the questions we ask of you in order to provide us with an understanding of the diversity of the register, and we're incredibly grateful to any registrant who's provided us with that information that allows us to understand the ethnic makeup, how many disabled people make up on the register, the sex orientation profile of our register. It's all fundamentally vital, because it's only when we've got information like that that we can tackle those really challenging subjects, like I've seen in other regulators. I've been involved in other regulators tackling issues around disproportionate representation in fitness to practice, for example, you know, and understanding, and I think it's really important for us to be honest at HCPC that this, you know, that's something we're at the beginning of. You know, that's a process that we've only really in the last couple of years been in a position to engage with meaningfully, and actually, you know, the work we've been doing over those years with registrants, with professional bodies, sharing information, understanding the experiences of registrants has been really fundamental to us, say, putting some of those foundational blocks in place. And I think that's what we've been doing, and that's what we'll be focusing on, you know, and what's coming next is really our ability to act upon that. So, you know, understanding, well, if we do see patterns, and that's not something we're even in a position to do at the moment, but if we do see, for example, patterns in fitness to practice, really understanding what are the drivers, you know, what is it that's happening? Is it as a consequence of something that we are doing as HCPC, as the regulator? Is it something that reflects the experience of people in the workforce? Making sure that we're playing an active, really dynamic role in that, addressing health inequalities and making clear that that's something that we should be capable of doing. And I think that's, for me, certainly that's our priority in the organisation. I think that's where we've been putting an awful lot of work in to try and push that forward.
Adrian, thank you very much for that really helpful reply, because I think, as you said, it's really important for us to acknowledge that as a regulator, we're also learning, as well as, you know, and keeping up with what is really a very fast-paced and vital part, you know, of current legislation and current practice. So I think it's really useful to have a very honest, you know, that very honest and transparent approach to, we're learning and we understand that there's so much expertise out there, so much great practice, but that many of us are still learning and thinking about ED&I as it relates to practice. The session has flown by today, but I have got some HCPC information for you. We have the next in our events on the new and updated standards of proficiency. So next up on the 7th of June is our updated standards on leadership, and on 19th of June, digital skills and new technology. So please do engage with those webinars if you can. We also have the updates to the current consultation is open on the updates to the standards of conduct, performance and ethics, and I would urge anyone who is interested in equality, diversity and inclusion specifically, please do take part in that and see what we are suggesting in relation to this for equality, diversity and inclusion. It's really important that we hear from as many of you as possible. Please do remember to connect with us at the HCPC across social medias, and please do keep your profiles up to date with the Health and Care Professions Council so that we can contact you and you can receive communications from us. It's been an opportunity today to share some learning with you around ED&I and look at what the updated standards are, and we're so grateful to Pam for sharing some of her in-depth knowledge and experiences around equality, diversity and inclusion in practice, and sharing some of the very candid experiences around the discrimination that she herself has faced. I think it's a really important learning point for us to stop and consider what our colleagues and our service users are experiencing from us, and to seek to try to be better in all areas around equality, diversity and inclusion. It just leaves me to thank you most sincerely for coming along to today's session and for being a part of this learning around the new standards for equality, diversity and inclusion. Many thanks to our speakers today, to Pam again for sharing with us so candidly about her experiences, and for Adrian for really articulating the very clear position of the HCPC in relation to ED&I. But thank you for your involvement today. I've enjoyed the session. It's been a great privilege, and I look forward to perhaps seeing some more of you at our other events in the future. Thank you very much everyone for your time and for your support today.